Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Veronica and I'm an ISTP. So as ISTPs, our dominant function is introverted thinking, so we tend to occupy our thoughts with evaluating the world around us and building internal logical structures through which we can understand the world. So we tend to value things like accuracy and truth and eliminating bias from our thinking. So as an ISTP myself, I think that I'm pretty self-aware of the factors that can influence my thinking, as well as other people's thinking. And yet, even though I've tried so hard to be self-aware, and I've really tried hard to be objective in my thinking, I still have repeatedly fallen into the trap of allowing subjectivity to warp my logic. So before I get into it, I want to clarify that I'm not trying to make the point that truth is subjective or that we can't know the truth. I actually really believe that logic is beautiful because we can use it to discover the objective truth, but I think we need to be careful because as humans, it is so easy to allow subjectivity to creep into our thinking and to lead us towards wrong conclusions. So I kind of was thinking back through my life and I came with a list of all the ways that I've seen subjectivity kind of mess with my logic, but I was able to take that and kind of condense it into just 4 really generic areas. And so these are going to be 4 areas where it's really easy for subjectivity to kind of enter in. And this was true for me, but I also think that this could be true for any personality type. So number 1 is not having all the facts. So sometimes you know that you don't have all the facts, but I think, and even especially for me, I think I'm usually very aware of how much I don't know. And yet even the times that I do think that I have really all the information I need on a certain topic, I'm usually wrong. And so I have found that often what I think is perfectly constructed logic is really nothing more than lofty ideals that aren't grounded in reality. So number 2 is inaccurate facts. So while it's absolutely possible and normal to have information that's incorrect due to bad sources, I think what I found is way more common is that I have been working with faulty assumptions that I just never thought to question or evaluate. And part of the reason that I never thought to question or evaluate them was because I wasn't even consciously aware that those assumptions were at the base of my logic. So number 3 is that it's very easy to have a skewed focus on certain data. So even when I have had pretty thorough information on a topic, my values, biases, emotions have definitely caused me to focus on or value certain data or trails of logic above others. They've caused me to preemptively assume that certain data is inaccurate or irrelevant to my situation. And they've also influenced which data I've even taken in and noticed. And so this kind of goes along with the idea of, you see what you look for. So there have been times where I could have made a logical case to support X and a logical case to support Y. And neither might have really been more solid than the other. But X and Y were not compatible conclusions. And so what influenced my conclusion was really my preference. So even though I could have made an argument for both, I saw one case as being more sound than the other just because it aligned better with what I preferred. Also, subjectivity kind of inevitably starts to enter in when I'm lacking information, and so I've had to assign a probability towards a certain outcome, or when I've had to assign a weight or a value to specific data to determine how much that data should influence my conclusion. All right, and number 4 is that it can be very difficult to determine at which point our theories should be considered facts. So think of it this way. Imagine you're building a tower, and this tower is built up using data and logic as its beams and joints. And while the tower is still in construction, you're continually looking over it and evaluating the structure to make sure that it doesn't have any flaws. But once you're satisfied that the structure is good enough, you take a step back, and instead of viewing the structure by the beams and joints that you were focused on before, you instead see it as being one single entity. So I think this is really common to at least how my brain works, and I imagine other people's minds work with logic, is that I have these logical structures that I'm forming in my mind, which are considered theories. And while it's still a theory, it's continually being tested and evaluated against new information that's coming in. But once I'm satisfied that the structure of my logic is good enough, I kind of take a step back, and instead of seeing the ins and outs of my theory, I'm satisfied to view my theory as one single entity, which I would consider fact. Now I say I would consider it fact because it might not actually be a fact, but for my purposes and inside my mind, I treat it as if it's a fact. And so the way I see it is that it's kind of like our brains condense these theories so that they take up less processing space in our minds. And then once we have more room in our minds to think, we can use these condensed ideas as building blocks for more logic. And so subjectivity inevitably enters in here at the point at which you have to decide if your theory is good enough. And I think people's brains work differently, and so that can really influence how they view it. But also just your biases can really influence it too. So self-awareness is good, but I really don't think, like I said before, that it's enough to actually overcome subjectivity in our thinking. I think that the single most important thing that we can do to eliminate this is to practice humility in our thinking. And so I kind of came up with 4 practical ways that we can practice humility in our thinking. There's probably more, but this is just what came to my mind. So the first is that you have to know that you aren't above having subjective logic. And you have to really believe it. And it doesn't matter how objective you think you are, your subjective thinking can really lead to warped logic, and I think that's just true of all humans. Number 2 is that you have to stop being self-reliant. So I really believe that humanity was intended to function best as a whole, and so you can't seclude your mind, because your mind is most effective when it's complemented by the minds of other people. And so going along with that, you have to avoid the temptation to only communicate your conclusions. Instead, you need to practice communicating your thought processes, because as you communicate your thought processes, people will have a much easier time poking holes in your logic. But you have to embrace this as a good thing, because when people poke holes in it, that gives you the opportunity to refine your logic. Number 3 is that you have to make sure you understand the people that disagree with you. And don't evaluate what they're saying just by the words that they use. Many people aren't good at logically communicating their thoughts, or they just communicate them in a way that's different than you would communicate them. So you have to make sure you truly understand what people are saying and what they believe and why they believe it. And until you actually understand them, you can't dismiss their thoughts. All right, and my 4th and final point is that you have to make sure that your goal isn't to be right. The objective truth lies outside of you, and so you need to make it your goal to agree with the truth. So that's all I've got. Thank you for listening, and please leave a comment and let me know what you think.